Recording by Avai in November 2016. Secresy, or The Ruin on the Rock by Eliza Fenwick. Volume 1, Letter 7. From Caroline Ashburn to Sibella Valmont. My dearest Sibella, to all that I yet know of you I give unmixed praise. Your own rectitude, your own discernment, and your reliance on my sincerity satisfies you of this truth, and I am assured that I have your sanction when I speak less of yourself than of frailer mortals. On casting my eye over the foregoing lines, I smile to perceive that I felt as if it were necessary to apologize for the strong propensity I have to begin this letter as I concluded my last, namely, with Mr. Murden, whom, in the moments of my best opinion, I cannot wholly admire, nor, at the worst of times, can I altogether condemn. As he is, then, or as I think he is, take him. Colonel Ridson, you know, said Mr. Murden was handsome. So say I. At times divinely handsome, but only at times. His figure, it is true, never loses its symmetry and grace, but his features, strongly influenced by their governing power, the mind, vary from beauty to deformity, that is, deformity of expression. What would Lady Mary, Lady Laura, or the two Miss Winderhams, who were lately added to our party, say to hear me connect the ideas of Murden and deformity? Yet in their hearing, incurring the terrible certainty of being arraigned in their judgments for want of taste, of being charged with prudery, affectation, and I know not what besides, I shall there repeat that I have looked on Murden, and looked from him again, because he appeared deformed and disgusting. The libertine is ever deformed, the flatterer is ever disgusting. His daily practice in this house justifies me in bestowing on him the latter epithet. I own, and I rejoice to own, that of the justice of the former I have my doubts. Vain he is. That he is gratified by, encourages, even stimulates the attention of fools and coquettes, I cannot deny, and when I view him indulging a weakness so contemptible, so dangerous, I am almost ready to believe he may be anything that is vicious, and that, having taken vanity and flattery for his guides, he may attain to the horrid perfection of a successful debauchee. Yet what man, plunged in the whirlpool of debauchery, ever retained delicacy of sentiment and pungency of feeling? I think Murden possesses both. What man of debased inclinations would preserve that perpetual delicacy, that happy medium between neglect and encouragement, by which Murden regulates his conduct to Lady Laura Bowden? Lady Laura, celebrated as a wit and beauty, betrays to every observer her passion for Mr. Murden. I dreaded, on such an occasion, to see a vain young man, insolent in pity or barbarous in neglect, but Lady Laura has not a particle more or less of his admiration, his flattery, and his services than any other lady of the circle. Ah, I feel already that my description languishes. The Murden before me is a being of more vigour and more interest than the Murden on my paper. I have failed in discriminating the contradictory parts of his character, and I give up description, leaving those circumstances I may, on further acquaintance, select from the round of his actions to speak for him. These insatiable devourers of amusement tear me from my pen. The morning, which in my mother's house in town I possessed uncontrolled, is no longer my own. The days are wasted in the execution of projects that promise much and perform nothing, and I made a whimsical attempt the other day to convince my good friends here that we ought at least to be rational 1/2 of one's time, if we would find any pleasure in being foolish the other half. But while I am complaining to you, Sibella, the party are perhaps complaining of me. Adieu for a short time. I go to taste simplicity. Not the simplicity of a golden age, but the simplicity of gold and tinsel. On the banks of a charming piece of water we fish under a silken awning. Horns, clarionets, and bassoons are stationed in a neighbouring grove, with their sweet concords occasionally to soothe our fatigues. Ices, the choicest fruits, and other delicate preparations for the refreshment of the palate are at hand, and, notwithstanding all this costly care, it is very possible we shall pass a listless morning, return without any increase of appetite or animal spirits, and be mighty ready to bestow loud commendations on the pleasures of a morning, from which we derive no other secret satisfaction than the certainty of its being at an end. A summons. The carriages are at the door. You understand, I hope, that this is a rural expedition, therefore a coach and a chariot attends. Mr. Murden drives one phaeton, Colonel Ridson another, and Mrs. Ashburn, who has arisen from the voluptuous luxury of the palanquin, and 8 slaves, to the more active triumph of a high seat, reins, and long whip, will drive Lady Laura Bowden in her curricle. It would be vain for me to attempt to sleep, for I endure at present a very considerable portion, though from a different cause, of those restless feelings which so often, my Sibella, urge you from your bed. I believe I shall not go to bed this night, yet I have not to tell you that I am roused to this wakefulness by events strikingly removed from the ordinary course of our lives. On the contrary, the accidents of the day, though new in their form, are by no means of an uncommon character. It is, alas, no novelty for some people to be inconsistent, and for others to imagine that rank and riches, as it places them beyond the reach of the common misfortunes of life, gives them full privilege to censure the weak and condemn the unfortunate. I hope benevolence is not a novelty. I would not subtract from the due praise of any individual, but I feel it as it were a tacit reproach upon human nature, or rather upon human manners, when we loudly vaunt the benevolent actions of any single man. I love the man, be he whom he may, who will perform the offices of a brother to the weakest, the most despised of his fellow creatures, but I lament that the example should be so unusual, and, when seen, rather vaunted than valued, and speedily forgotten. I have no reason to accuse myself of a want of penetration. Our morning was anything but pleasant. The air from the water chilled Sir Thomas. Lady Barlow could find no scope amidst the very small talk for one single repartee. The Earl of Ulson had the toothache. The Countess detests the music of wind instruments, and my mother found out that she hated fishing. The young ladies lost their spirits and temper by losing Mr. Murden, whose absence occurred in such a way as put me out of temper, and out of spirits also. As we were on the road to the destined spot of diversion, a pretty country girl on a horse loaded with panniers drew up to the hedge-side, while the cavalcade passed her. I was in Mr. Murden's phaeton, and we were the last carriage but one. The girl, in making her awkward obeisance to the company, no sooner lifted her eyes to Mr. Murden than she blushed deeper than scarlet. It was a blush of such deep shame, of such anguish, that I felt a sudden pain like a shock of electricity. The time of passing was so instantaneous that I could not see what effect the blush had at the moment on Murden's countenance, but when I did look on him, I found him lost in thought, from which he presently started, to gaze back upon the girl, while she continued in sight. It was palpably obvious that in this incident Murden had a concern more powerful than any interest he took in the party, for he remained dispirited and absent, and, after refusing to angle and walking a few turns to and fro on the banks of the water, he said he should join us again before we returned to dinner, mounted his servant's horse, and disappeared. Thus we were left without one satisfied person of the party, except the ever-satisfied Colonel Ridson and the self-satisfied Lord Bowden. We saw no more of Mr. Murden till late in the afternoon. I must now, my dear Sibella, call your attention to the history of an unfortunate woman, who, in occupying the greatest part of this afternoon, gave scope to the display of that hard-heartedness and that benevolence to which I alluded in a former passage of this letter. When Sir Thomas Barlow left the East Indies, he retained in his service a young Creole as secretary. At that time the youth, who was sanguine enough and young enough to believe that his situation would increase in gain and be permanent in favour, wrote to his mother, whom he contributed to support, saying it was his wish she should come to England. He expected she would wait for a remittance for him to pay her passage, but the mother, impatient to join her only child, sold her little property, borrowed on her son's credit the remainder of the money for her passage, and set sail from Bengal much about the time that her son, with whom the climate had disagreed, and whom Sir Thomas had discharged, set sail from England. Arrived in London, she hastens to Sir Thomas Barlow's house to meet this beloved son. The family are in the country. The porter surlily assures her that her son is gone. She will not believe him, demands the name of Sir Thomas Barlow's country seat, returns to her lodging with trembling limbs and an aching heart, writes a letter to Barlow Hall, which probably was never sent, and falls ill of an ague and fever. 8 weeks the unhappy woman languished in the extreme of misery and disease, receiving no tidings from her son, having no friend, no acquaintance, either to pity or relieve her. Her money all spent, her clothes almost all sold, she availed herself of a small recruit of strength, and begged her way, half naked, to Sir Thomas Barlow's seat, kept alive, no doubt, by the feeble hope that she should yet find her son. At Barlow Hall the tidings of her son's departure was confirmed. Despair gave her strength. In spite of the servant's opposition, she forced her way into the dining-parlour, ere the dessert was yet removed. She designed to have thrown herself at the feet of Sir Thomas, but on whom did her eyes first fix? On no other than Mrs. Ashburn, whom, in her own land, in her happiest days, she had served in the capacity of housekeeper. Had the apartment held the first potentates of the earth, I firmly believe they would have been as so many straws in the poor woman's way when she rushed forward to Mrs. Ashburn. She clasped her knees, kissed her hands, her gown, the very chair on which she sat, and was so wild and extravagant in her joy that I do not wonder at the result. I only wonder that her intellects survived. It was in vain the company expressed their disgust at so miserable an object. In vain my mother and Sir Thomas commanded her to rise and withdraw. She would, in her imperfect language, curse the climate of Britain. She would entreat them to send her back to her own country. She would relate the history of her griefs, till combined recollections, or perhaps the frigid countenances of those around her, wrought a passionate flood of tears, and she then quietly suffered the footman to conduct her from the room. The rigid Countess of Ulson instantly began a severe investigation of the folly of the young Indian, who sent so far for his mother, while his own prosperity was yet wavering and uncertain. Lady Barlow and the young ladies appeared disconcerted. The Earl of Ulson had dined in his own chamber. Colonel Ridson often shifted his seat. Mrs. Ashburn and Sir Thomas Barlow gave their assent to the invective of Lady Ulson, adding at the same time all the shades of imprudence in the mother's enterprise. They agreed, however, in the necessity of affording her some relief. 2 guineas from Sir Thomas and 2 from Mrs. Ashburn was the vast sum contributed, and with this 4 guineas the servant was ordered to deliver the following commands: that she should immediately go back to London, where she might easily find employment for her support till her son should know she was in England, and remit money for her return to India. Colonel Ridson stole to the door after the servant, and gave into his hand a benefaction for the widow. I had only waited the conclusion of the nabob's and my mother's determination, and I now left them. The Indian did not, as before, attempt to rush into the parlour, but in the hall she wrung her hands, gnashed her teeth, tore her hair, exclaiming she must go back, she could not work, she could not live in a climate that would kill a dog. My remonstrances she did not hear. I might as well have spoken to the dead. It was then that Mr. Murden returned home. Astonished at the frantic agonies of the poor distressed woman, he inquired the cause from the servants, whom pity had drawn around her. He drew his whip out of his hand, and coming up to the Indian, yes, Sibella, this seducer perhaps, this very elegant, fashionable, handsome, and admired Murden, immediately lifted in his arms the poor miserable despised object, from whose touch others had revolted, carried her into an apartment, and seated her by himself on a sofa, still holding his arm round her to prevent her relapsing into those violent excesses. "You shall go back," cried Murden. "I swear by the God that made me, you shall go back to-morrow, to-day, this very hour, if you will but be calm." She looked on him steadily. It was such a look, Sibella. "See," said Murden, "Miss Ashburn says you shall go back. You know Miss Ashburn?" "Ay, and you love her too. I know you do." In a fainting voice she said, "Then I shall die with my poor Joseph at last." Her head fell upon Murden's breast, and he suffered it to remain there, till he found she had become insensible. He then requested the housekeeper to see a bed prepared for her, and, by his kind speeches and charming tones, he rendered every servant as eager to do the poor woman service as he himself had been. All this time I forgot the country girl. While I attended the Indian to her bed, Mr. Murden visited the drawing-room, and when I also went thither, I found Murden's face in a glow. He was debating with his uncle on the danger that might befall his sick patient, by removing her from Barlow Hall to the next village, and the danger Sir Thomas might incur by allowing her to remain where she was. The nabob recollected she had spoken of her fever in London, and already he saw himself in the utmost danger, and half his family dead or dying of the mortal disease. Any sum of money, anything in his house that could tend to her accommodation she might have, so that she was but removed. He absolutely shook with apprehension, and Murden was at length compelled to yield the point. A post-chaise was accordingly got ready. 2 maids went in with her, to support her, for successive faintings had reduced her to the weakness of an infant. Murden, although it was a rainy evening, walked by the side of the chaise to the village, to see that she was there taken proper care of. In the drawing-room, the interval between this arrangement and the time of Murden's return from the village was passed in the most irksome state. The weather would not allow of walking or riding. No casual visitors arrived. Every common topic of conversation languished, and each individual dreaded lest some other of the party should begin to speak of the Indian, whom they were one and all laboriously urgent to forget. The entrance of tea and coffee was an immense relief. Their cups were received with unusual complacency, and their drooping spirits revived. The card tables were just arranged when Murden entered. Good God, what a charm was diffused over his countenance! He was pale with fatigue and want of food, his linen soiled, and his hair disordered with the wind and rain, but there was such a sweetness in his eyes that no heart could resist it. Every one pronounced his name at once. "Dear Murden!" breathed Lady Laura in the melting voice of love. Then, covered with confusion, she added, "Dear Mr. Murden, you will kill yourself." At the same time she made an involuntary motion for him to seat himself between her and her sister. He did so. His heart was open to the reception of all tenderness. He could not reject Lady Laura's tone. He took her hand. I saw him press it. He said something low and soft, and her cheeks were instantly suffused with a burning colour. "Ah, that country girl," thought I. I could not help sighing for her. I sighed too for Murden. Would, said I to myself, that he could suffer me to possess his confidence, would suffer me to advise, exhort, and entreat him to be worthy of himself. Perhaps, while these and other such reflections occupied my mind, my eyes were fixed upon Murden, for suddenly I perceived that his cheek took a stronger glow than even Lady Laura's, and he sprung up from his seat. "James, bring me some biscuits and a jelly," said he carelessly. "Egad, I believe I have not dined to-day." This was enough to rouse Sir Thomas. "There now," cried the nabob. "Was ever anything like it? You have had no dinner, and here you are all this time in wet clothes. Lord have mercy upon me. Call your valet." And he began to ring the bell furiously. "I am sure, Arthur, you will be ill. You will have a fever. You will certainly kill yourself, as Lady Laura says." I had too much compassion to look at Lady Laura, and so had Murden, for he crossed the other side of the room and immediately withdrew. As Murden shut one door, a servant opened another, and gave into my hands your last dear letter. I retired to my own chamber to read it. "You are a glorious girl, Sibella. You elevate, you excite me. You awaken my mind to more and more love of those fervid qualities that shine so eminent in you. Had your Bonneville lived— Well, fear not, my love. The day of your liberty will come. There are perhaps other Bonnevilles in the world, who will, like him, delight to give you that instruction for which your mind pants. Already you possess energy, fortitude, and feeling, and those qualities, now kept alive and fostered by your love, may one day be called into action by objects of higher magnitude, of far higher value, forgive me, than love, though it were the love of a Sibella. I stood at my window to read your letter. The rain and wind had ceased. There was not even breeze enough to shake away the drops that yet rested upon the leaves. The dim, grey, melancholy remains of day just afforded sufficient light to read by, and, when I had finished your letter, I threw up the sash and leaned out, thinking of you, my Sibella, in my imagination seeing you, seeing your fawn, your wood, your oak, your black angry-looking rock, your solemn ruin, your clumps of yew trees, your white marble tomb. And these objects engrossed my whole attention, while those which surrounded me became hid in darkness. Footsteps passed underneath my window through a path leading to the stables. One voice said, "Many and many a hard day's work have my poor dame and I done since, and have gone to bed to cry and moan all night for Peggy's naughtiness. We were ashamed to show our faces in our own parish. But your honour assures me you won't forget her." Another voice answered, "All that I have promised I will perform, depend on it." The latter voice was Murden's. Now I felt the chill air of evening, and I shut down my window. "Won't you have candles brought, ma'am?" asked Agnes, entering my chamber. Only think, ma'am, continued she, if that good Mr. Murden is not going to send one of the grooms 8 miles for a physician to come to the poor Indian, because the laundry maid, who is just returned from her, told him she is not any better. I believe there never was such a young gentleman. Do you know where he is now? Said I. Gone to the stables, ma'am, to hurry away the groom. Is any one with him? Only an old farmer who has been in his dressing-room while he dined. I dare say Mr. Murden has been doing some good thing or other for him too. I hope he has, replied I. All that I have promised I will perform, depend on it, I repeated to myself. Light me downstairs, Agnes, said I. I hope, indeed, Mr. Murden has done him some kindness. Agnes looked at me attentively and did not reply to me. I returned to the drawing-room, divested of that pleasurable glow of feeling which I enjoyed before the voices spoke underneath my window. As I entered the room, Lord Ulson was saying to my mother, "Such a reference as you propose, madam, would be unpardonable from me, nor can we possibly expect the lady will be sincere." I was surprised to understand, from the Earl's bow, that I was the subject of their conversation, and I requested that, if his lordship meant me, he would hereafter never expect to find me insincere, and I begged to know I had merited the accusation. Mrs. Ashburn and the Earl mutually explained. His lordship was persuaded, it seems, that a letter exciting such visible pleasure as that did which the servant delivered to me must be from a favoured lover. My mother was certain the effect was produced by my romantic friendship, to use her own expression, and, as the Earl was incredulous, she was desirous of referring the decision to me. Lady Laura affectedly begged I would defend the sweet powers of friendship, and my mother sneeringly observed that I had a fine scope for my talents in the present instance. I took your letter from my pocket. I unfolded and spread it open in my lap. "This is the letter," said I. "A pretty hand," said Colonel Ridson. "Nay, it is not a female character, Miss Ashburn," the Earl said. I asked if I should read it. The Earl professed to admire my condescension, but my mother yawned. I selected 2 passages from your letter and read them. Lord Ulson, who had only chosen this subject for want of something to do, was now perfectly satisfied and convinced, for Sir Thomas had invited him to piquet. The Colonel thought your style very charming. Lady Barlow thought it very dull, and, as no one contradicted her ladyship's opinion, the subject would here have ended, had I not, as I put the letter again into my pocket, told my mother that her friend Mrs. Valmont had lately been ill. A poor inanimate vapoured being, Mrs. Ashburn called her friend, dying, she said, of diseases whose slightest symptom had never reached her, a burden to herself, and a torment to every one else. Nevertheless, her fate to be pitied, lamented, and deplored without bounds. Then it became your uncle's turn, and his sum of enormities was divided and subdivided into multitudes of sins, so that I was ready to ask myself if I had really ever known this Mr. Valmont. No one spark of pity remained for him. No, he was neither pitied by Mrs. Ashburn, nor prayed for by the Countess of Ulson. When my mother had exhausted her topic, I said to her, "Your pictures are vivid to-night, madam. Suppose you finish the family. Miss Valmont, what say you of her?" "I leave her to you," replied Mrs. Ashburn. "I only think her a little handsome, a little proud, a little ignorant, and half insane. You can tell the rest." "Pray do, Miss Ashburn," cried Lady Mary Bowden. "I dearly love to hear of queer creatures." "I am to add," said I, all that remains of a queer creature, already declared to be proud, ignorant, and half mad. To the best of my judgment, I will. The door opened, and in came Mr. Murden, and the poor Indian, the country girl, and the old farmer, who had wept sleepless nights for Peggy's naughtiness, together rushed upon my imagination. Again Lady Laura made room for Murden, and again he took his seat on the same sofa. I said to myself, as I looked at him, where are the signs of remorse? There are none. Not even the softened eye of new-born virtuous resolutions. Strange that I read of nothing in the face but inward peace and freedom. "Do go on, Miss Ashburn," cried Lady Mary. "I did, Sibella. I began once more to speak of you, and in a little time I called back a part at least of the vigour and warmth which Mr. Murden's entrance and a train of fugitive thought had chased from me. I began with your beauty. I omitted nothing which I could devise to make the picture worthy of the original. I spoke of the first sight I had of you, the impressive effect at that moment of your face, your form, your attitude, your simple attire. I appealed to my mother, to testify the singular beauty of your eyes, your forehead, your mouth, your hair. I told them that your hair had never been distorted by fashion, that, parted from the top of the head and always uncovered, it fell around your shoulder, displaying at once its profusion and its colour, and ornamenting, as well by its shade as its contrast, one of the finest necks that ever belonged to a human figure. Lady Laura now grew restless in her seat, for Murden listened. He had even dropped the shuttle he had taken out of Lady Laura's hand, and either inattentively, or quite unconsciously, had allowed her ladyship to stoop to the ground for it herself. Still he listened. "Thus adorned by nature," said I, "in what way shall I further recommend her? Art has disclaimed her. This queer creature, Lady Mary, never out of her uncle's castle since she was 6 years old, has been left utterly without the skill of the governess and waiting-maid. An old tutor, indeed, gave her some singular lessons on the value of sincerity, independence, courage, and capacity, and she, a worthy scholar of such a teacher, as indeed you may judge from the specimen I read of her letter, has odd notions and practices, and, half insane, as Mrs. Ashburn says, would rather think herself born to navigate ships and build edifices than to come into a world for no other purpose than to twist her hair into ringlets, learn to be feeble, and to find her feet too hallowed to tread on the ground beneath her." "Stop!" cries Murden, bending eagerly forward. "Tell me, Miss Ashburn, of whom you speak." "Of a Miss Valmont," said Lady Laura peevishly. "Miss Valmont!" rejoined Murden. "Miss Ashburn, do you really speak of Miss Valmont?" "I really do, Mr. Murden." He did not reply again, but, folding his arms, he leaned thoughtfully on the back of the sofa. Lady Laura, now quite out of temper, began to complain that he was an encumbrance, and, forgetting to offer the least apology, he instantly sprang up and took a distant chair. I should tell you that by this time my mother, Sir Thomas, the Earl, and the Colonel were at cards, so that I had only Lady Barlow and the younger part of the company for my auditors. "And how," asked Lady Mary, "does this odd young lady, I must not again say queer creature, employ her time?" "Playing with cats and dogs, and chattering with servants, I suppose," said Lady Barlow. "No, Lady Barlow," I replied, "the resources of her mind, various and increasing, to use her own description, furnish better expedients. She wishes for communication, for intercourse, for society, but she is too sincere to purchase any pleasure by artifice and concealment. She is too proud to tempt the servants from their duty, all of whom, except 2, are forbidden to approach her. A grey-headed, unpolished footman brings her breakfast and supper to her apartment. If she is there, it is well. If not, he leaves it, be the time longer or shorter, till she does come. Her female domestic, deaf and deformed, would attend if summoned, but Miss Valmont finds her dress simple enough, and her limbs robust enough, to enable her to perform all the functions of her toilet. A true child of nature, bold in innocence, day or night, is equally propitious to her rambles, and always mentally alive, she has the glow of animation on her cheeks, the fire of vivacity in her eye, alone in a solitary wood at noonday or at midnight. "At midnight!" Lady Laura exclaimed. "Surely you did not go alone into the woods at midnight?" I removed the idea her ladyship and others perhaps had of its impropriety, by informing them your wood was of small extent, not distant from the castle, and enclosed within the moat, which, by means of a canal, had been carried round the park as well as castle. "No human foot," said I, "but those admitted over the drawbridge can enter this wood, which though small is romantic, and though gloomy has its beauties. It rises on the side of the canal, and terminates at the foot of a rock. It contains a tomb. On one part of the rock are spread the tottering ruins of a small chapel and hermitage, and these objects serve to invite Miss Valmont to her wood, while they check the approach of diseased imaginations." I spoke further, Sibella, of your favourite lonely haunt, the flying speed with which I have seen you bound there, the affectionate caresses of your little fawn, and numberless other circumstances. Lady Laura was resolved neither to be amused by the novelty, nor seduced by the merit I had attributed to you. She found you more whimsical than pleasing, more daring than delicate. She wished you all manner of good things, and, among the rest, that you might not at last fall in love with one of your uncle's footmen. I smiled, and replied to her ladyship that your uncle's wisdom and foresight had provided against that misfortune. You already had a lover worthy of you. "Good God! Are you acquainted with Clement Montgomery?" It was Murden from whom this exclamation burst, and I looked at him without power to reply. It almost appeared miraculous to hear any one in that room name Clement Montgomery. "Is that the Mr. Montgomery," Lady Barlow asked, "you went abroad with, Murden?" "Yes, madam." "Then," said I, "you know Clement Montgomery intimately." He replied that he did. "How could you be so cruel?" said I. "Why did you not interrupt me long since? You, who know Miss Valmont's lover, must know Miss Valmont also. Why did you not take the voice of that lover, and paint, as you must have heard him paint, her attractive graces, her noble qualities? Oh, it was barbarous to leave that to be done by monotonous friendship, to which the spirit of love could alone do justice." Methinks his answer was a very strange one, so cold, so abrupt. I felt displeased at the moment, and checked myself in some eager question I was about to ask respecting Clement Montgomery. Murden's reply, Sibella, was, that I had done enough. And he withdrew too, immediately withdrew, as if weary of me and my subject. At supper his place at table was vacant. His valet alleged he was writing letters. Sir Thomas would be positive he was ill. We heard of nothing but the fever, and it is highly probable the house would have been presently half filled with physicians, and Sir Thomas really in need of them, if Murden had not come smiling and languishing into the supper-room. This time I had the honour of his choosing his seat next me, and as I saw that he only pretended to eat in order to appease his uncle, I told him in a low voice I believed he was ill. "My mind is my disease," he said. "Ah, then," thought I, "he does perhaps repent." I longed to talk to him, but I could think of no subject, no name but Peggy, and Peggy I had not courage to mention. I made an awkward remark upon our ride to the water-side. Then I introduced as awkwardly, and to as little purpose, the time of my leaning out of my chamber window. Murden, unconscious of my meaning and allusions, heard me composedly, and I ended only where I began. He found me absent and embarrassed, and, though little suspecting that his mind was also my disease, his attentions were more exclusively mine than I had ever before experienced them to have been. A few minutes before the company separated, Murden said to me, "I am informed, Miss Ashburn, that you intend visiting our poor Indian to-morrow morning." "Yes," I said, "I had ordered my horse early for that purpose." "I should request your permission to attend you, madam, but I am in some sort engaged to eat my breakfast on brown bread and new milk at a farmhouse." "A farmhouse?" said I. "Yes, madam," rejoined Murden, as calmly as though he had carried content and joy into that farmhouse, instead of remorse and misery. "Yes, madam, the most charming spot in this country. My constant house of call in the shooting season. Many pleasant brown bread breakfasts and suppers have I eaten there." So unblushing, so hard-hearted a confession absolutely startled me. I had already risen to retire. He rose also, and said, "Will you, Miss Ashburn, allow me to ride with you in the morning?" "And neglect the farmhouse, Mr. Murden?" He replied, "The time is of little consequence. I can go there afterward." "Oh, but it is," said I, "now of infinite consequence. Not for the world would I be the means of your dispensing with one title of your promises to that farmhouse. Pray," said I, turning back after having bade him good night, "Mr. Murden, do you correspond with Clement Montgomery?" Again I became reconciled to him. Again I was persuaded that he repented of his error, and that he is not hardened in his transgressions, for he understood the fullest tendency of my question. His countenance instantly expressed shame, surprise, and sorrow too, and his voice faltered while he said, "Why, Miss Ashburn, why should you wish to know that?" And when he added, "I do indeed, madam, correspond with Mr. Montgomery," he looked from me. My good night was more cordial than the former one, and I hope that if Mr. Murden finds his breakfast at the farmhouse less pleasant than heretofore, its usefulness will increase, as its pleasure ceases. Daylight burst into my chamber. In another hour I shall prepare to visit the Indian. My Sibella, farewell. Caroline Ashburn. End of Section 7.